This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank Jenny for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. It's kind of it's a complete honor to be invited to your undergrad, especially when undergrad is Cornell, right? So I want to talk about a few different projects, mainly spanning much of my work in urban landscapes, in particular, a lot of that in New York City and New Jersey in general. But also I'm going to talk a little bit about some global work that I've been doing to understand drivers and patterns of biodiversity at the urban biodiversity at the global scale. This picture, I think, kind of captures a lot of what I do and what I'm interested in. This is a restored salt marsh in Secaucus, New Jersey, and as you see, I'm looking towards New York City with the Empire State Building, and there's a variety of landscapes here and plant communities that are interesting and provide biodiversity and ecosystem function to the city and surrounding landscape. So I'd like to start this talk with why urban, right? Why is urban interesting? And I think a lot of you're here so that I don't really have to convince you that urban systems are important and interesting to study, but we are an urban species, right? So over 55% of the human population lives in urban areas, urban and suburban areas. In the United States, it's closer to 80%, and in New York, I think it's something like 90%. So our experience as humans is an urban experience in general. So those numbers are rapidly increasing, and the urban area itself is actually increasing more and more faster than the urban population. So as the urban area increases, our populations increase, we also increase our global connectivity and how we're connected as a global society, and how ecology and organisms are connected across the world. So this is a travel time. So across the terrestrial landscape, this is travel time to major cities, with the lighter colors being 0, 1, 2, 3 hours to get to a city of 50,000 or more. So it's not even, that's a fairly small city, actually. And the darker colors being days. So, you pretty much have to be in the middle of Tibetan Plateau or the Amazon or Greenland. That'll take days to get somewhere. Otherwise, we're highly connected. And this is shipping lane density. So we're connected both across the oceans and across the terrestrial surface. So why cities in general? But I find cities to be fascinating. Cities across the globe have similar structure, including high spatial heterogeneity, different habitat types. So from this picture of Cape Town, you can see that it's not all the built environment, right? Cities highly heterogeneous with many different habitats. There's mountains here. Excuse me for a second. It always does that. Okay. So there's natural areas, there's parkland, golf courses, coastal habitats. So cities have high habitat heterogeneity, but they also have a lot of similarities, right? The built environment is very similar structure, similar disturbed types of habitats. And also all cities have some level of high density of built structures and impervious surfaces, fragmentation of native habitats, and they're the epicenters of exotic species invasions. And that makes cities inherently novel and makes them really, they're novel ecosystems. So novel being defined by Hobbes as ecosystems containing new combinations of species arising through human action, environmental change, and deliberate or accidental introduction of invasive species. And this brings apart not only new communities, ecological communities, but new ecosystem processes, changing nutrient cycling, organic matter dynamics, and so on. But why do we care, right? So I mentioned that we're an urban species. We spend most of our time in cities or suburban areas. And there's a lot of concern over the loss of uniqueness, both across cities. So if you go to a city in Brazil, major cities in Brazil, or major cities in China, or major cities in Europe, and major cities in the US, we share a lot of the same cultivated ornamental species, street trees, right? So there's a concern over the loss of uniqueness or biological uniqueness that different areas have. And as we're more connected, like I showed you in the first slide, we are moving species across, and there are particular species that are more either pre-adapted or have adapted to cities, and so they would be found across the same cities too. I focus primarily on plant communities, which is why I'm invited to the horticulture section. And the quality of plant communities affects both ecosystem processes, function of food webs, and biodiversity in general. And so this is really what I'm interested in, is understanding the patterns, drivers, and function of these novel habitats. So then if we know what's driving biodiversity and ecosystem function in these habitats, we can apply that to design, planning, and management. So I want to start out just by, just by talking about that cities are actually very diverse. And this is still, we accept that now, but that wasn't even accepted 10 years ago, right? The cities actually hold a lot of diversity. And so one of the first studies I did with a group of other ecologists and biodiversity scientists across the world was to collate data from many different cities across the world on bird data and plants. So the city floras and city avifaunas. The city floras were only spontaneous species, so not cultivated species or species that, plant species that need human intervention to live in the city. So they could be non-native species that escaped cultivation, but also includes many of the native species that are found at established spontaneous populations. And so we put together all this data, and first thing you should see, right, is that there's a lot of work in Europe, in particular in Germany, because Germany, I like to say the Germans are very efficient, and they've mapped all of their flora across the whole country. So we know a lot about the flora of Germany and urban flora in general. There are some big major gaps in our understanding of floras, especially birds too, that we've added to this data since this slide. But there's a lot of big gaps, and so most of our understanding of urban biodiversity is focused on the northern hemisphere. So of these cities, we only had 110 cities. They actually support 5% of the world's plant species and 20% of the world's birds. We also found that they're anthropogenic ecosystems with a mix of natives, but overall, as far as species richness goes, or the number of unique species, cities overall retain about 70% of those species are native of plants, and 94% of bird species are native. There are a few cosmopolitan species, and those I think are the really, really interesting ones. And we also found that cities are unique. And so there's a lot of concern. A bunch of papers have been written about this, that cities are homogenized, that where you have, because of introducing new plants and new animals, and also because of their characteristics, that all cities are the same. So you go to New York, you go to Berlin, you go to Beijing, and they're all going to have the same species. But what we're finding is that cities are actually, cities are actually very similar. They cluster within their geographic range. And so we found this for birds too. This is a big project in collaboration with Frank Lessort from the Lab of O. But cities are still retaining their unique geographic heritage. Here's New York, which is clustered, of course, fortunately not clustered with Berlin, but it's clustered within its own within its geographic region. So similar flora to Boston, Baltimore, and so on. All right. So what about, sorry about this. So what about those cosmopolitan species? These are the species that we found in almost all cities, so up to 90% of cities in each biogeographic realm. So on all continents except for Antarctica, right? So in they're primarily found across the world. And what do we see here? We could go outside and within a 10-minute walk find all of these species, right? So they're ubiquitous species. And I like to tell my classes that think about why these species are successful. What are the adaptations that they have, or are they developing to be successful in cities? And one of the big things is you'll recognize a lot of these as weeds, right? Both crop weeds, agricultural weeds, but also common garden weeds, and then some invasives like Phragmites here. So we also looked at some metrics of that the Convention on Biological Diversity has established as metrics of biodiversity. And we find that cities, like I said, are primarily native, dominated by native species, at least in terms of species richness, both for plants and birds, except for cities, here's where New York sits, except for cities in Australasia, and those are New Zealand and Australian cities. In particular, New Zealand cities are highly invaded. New Zealand's flora has doubled since European colonization because of introductions. All right, so this led us to think about what are the filters that shape biodiversity. So there's a lot of conceptual models that thinking about what shapes community assembly, but we wanted to take those and apply it to urban systems. So of course, regional species is important, right? The regional climate, land use, and surrounding area is important to determine the regional species pool. But then there's a series of filters that determine the urban species pool, and even more so, even more filters that determine what is in the local community or the habitat. And so I have started my research program in particular to start to look at these different filters. And I'm gonna give a couple case studies where we've examined particular filters such as urban form, species interactions, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about this human facilitation filter, which is management, right? And our choice of plant species. At the global scale, we found that the best predictors of plants and native plants were the cities. So we were really interested, okay, we can look at these geographic trends, these, common, we all know that species latitude is an important determinant of biological diversity, and things like precipitation and climate drive biomes and drive species distributions. But what about cities? Are we seeing that there are features of cities that are more important in determining species, in this case, species density, or the number of species per kilometer? And what we found is that for plants in particular, that the intact vegetation within and surrounding the city, as well as the age of the city, are important predictors of plant species diversity. Age was a really interesting finding because we actually found that older cities have higher plant species richness. And we can attribute that to these new rapidly developing cities. There's not a lot of natural areas, both in the development patterns, set aside in the development patterns, sorry. But also that these older cities have undergone processes of succession after they were established as cities.
Myla, in this case, is overall plant density referring to density of native species or all species?
All species, I apologize. Yeah, so native overall, this plant density is all species, and this is native plant density. So we're seeing just native plants. So we're seeing similar trends in what drives native plants as well as non-natives. So I said some of these drivers. What else at the more landscape scale might be driving species diversity and why we find particular species where we find them? Urban form is really important. Cities have different levels of natural areas, different types of green spaces, and buildings and things like that. And so this urban form really determines species processes, in particular dispersal. I'm really interested in dispersal. So one study we did was we looked at the dispersal and connectivity of urban river systems in terms of connectivity for native plant species. So riparian areas are often the largest amount of green space, natural green space left in a city. So if you look at pretty much any aerial photo of a city, where you see large linear corridors are where you see these even small but linear corridors are riparian areas where the streams haven't been buried or paved over, and so we set up different plots along different types of urban and suburban areas. And so, for example, these plots are along this dark area here is a natural area versus these are much more, this is more suburban, and some of ours are more in industrial areas and so on. And so we were interested in both the effect of surrounding land use type on dispersal, but also the immediate surrounding. And so just to show you what we found, one of the most interesting results of this study was that, yes, urban river systems are acting as corridors and connectivity for native plant species and invasive plants, which we assumed invasive plants, but they are important for native plants. But that anthropogenic species are moving in the system very easily. And so what this is, the riverbank, this is species, the top species dominant species that we found in the riparian areas along the riverbank. These are the species that we found in the litter. So what we did was we collected leaf litter and trash and material at once a month. And then we stratified them for 3 months, cold stratified for 3 months, and grew up in the greenhouse. And we identified what was moving in the river. And so we're seeing a lot of, so Acer rubrum, which is a native plant, is moving in the litter and it's on the riverbank. But we see a lot of these really anthropogenic, these are crabgrasses, right? So they're moving along the river system. The other one I wanted to point out was Polygonum cuspidatum. This is a non-native, I think the name has changed, but it's a non-native plant from Japan. And this was an interesting one because we found it all along, both on the riverbank and in the leaf litter. And what we found is that we also looked at municipalities and how they're managing. So these river systems crossed, I think, about 200 municipalities within, and they're all managing their river banks differently. And so we really, this result right here really shows that if cities, towns are managing the river and managing invasive species along the river downstream and nobody's doing anything upstream, it doesn't matter. Right? These municipalities need to talk to each other. They don't talk to each other. I worked with Karen O'Neill, who's a political social scientist, and these municipalities do not talk to each other. And so it's really futile to manage downstream for some of these invasive plants that these municipalities are actually managing for if there's no management upstream, because they're just moving right down the river system. Same thing with Microstygium viminium, which is another important invasive plant in forest and riparian systems. moving on to species interactions. Species interactions, especially looking at canopy forest species, has not been looked at a lot. It's actually pretty poorly studied in cities. And so one of my graduate students, Max Piana, who actually just successfully defended recently, we set up an experiment looking at urban forests, and these are natural forests, so, and rural forests. The urban forests were all in New York City, so he had sites in Van Cortlandt Park, Inwood Hill Park, and Pelham Bay. The rural forests were just a little bit north of the city, same geology as the urban forests, so similar soils, and they're all oak hickory dominated forests. And we were interested in this question. So Max did a lot of work on canopy tree dynamics and plant population dynamics, really to ask this question, are urban forests resilient? So are they, what's regeneration like in these forests? What are the limitations? What's recruitment limitation? What are the different factors that are driving urban forests? Are they able to sustain populations on their own? Or do we need active management approaches? And then also, where do we need those? If we need active management approaches, where do we need? Is it at the seedling stage? Is it at the sapling stage? And so, is it at the seed dispersal stage? And so one of the projects he did, which was really fascinating and really shows how species interactions may change from urban to rural landscapes, is seed predation. He set out seeds of many different species, so a couple different oak species, hickory species, as well as tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, and Acer platanoides, the Norway maple, and looked at what are the rates of seed removal, and this is a proxy for seed predation. And what he found over 3 years was that urban seed removal, really these curves of seed removal over time, really didn't change. They're very similar across time. The red, that's the urban. But the rural seed removal rates, really, they varied. So we're seeing sustained high seed removal rates in urban, and we're seeing this high, low, high removal rates in rural. Now, the rural are following masting dynamics of the trees. So this masting dynamics of oak trees and rodent populations. So here was the year before this, in 2015, was a mast year, so rodent populations were really high, and therefore there was high food resources in 2015, a lot of acorns, and then there was low food which brought the population really high, and so that's why there's high removal rates. But 2016 was not a mast year, therefore the populations of the rodents, so primarily squirrels and chipmunks, crashed, and you see low seed removal rates. So we see this typical, very common rodent to acorn masting dynamics in the rural, but we do not see that in the urban. Why? There's many, we don't know yet, right? So there could be increased granivore abundance because of supplementary food resources in the city. Maybe there's altered granivore community and identity, different granivores, squirrels versus chipmunks versus other blue jays. And also maybe there's altered granivore behavior in cities. So there is some evidence, especially done with squirrels, that their behavior changes, particularly in terms of responding to humans. So the more humans that are in a park, the less scared the squirrels are. Vice versa. So where are all these dynamics happening? I like to talk a lot about urban green spaces. This is where I would argue that the main ecological processes, ecosystem functions, ecosystem services, and human interactions with nature are occurring. And so we've just defined urban green spaces to include all natural, semi-natural, and artificial ecological systems. So they range from remnant to green, even to highly engineered green roofs. And I believe this is one of the roofs on West Campus. And so they range across, and there's different ecological processes, and it's more simply, we can also say that management intensity increases as you go from these remnant and or naturally vegetated sites all the way to these green roofs or home gardens and so on. Economic input increases, but native species diversity decreases as you go from the more engineered sites all the way to these remnants. So why focus on green spaces? So I said, right, this is where I would argue that ecological processes, the most important ecological processes are occurring, but they support assemblages of plants and animals, including some new evidence that green spaces in cities are supporting rare and endangered species or acting as refugia for these species. They support environmental functions, but also they have very important social applications or important for social dynamics, including shaping the character of the city or the neighborhood, providing a sense of place for inhabitants and people to go to, and providing a range of human health benefits. So we've asked some questions about both research questions in management and also in ecology, questions like, these are things we really don't know, and we really need to know because these have direct applications to planning and design of cities for nature in cities and also for people's human health and well-being. So how large do urban green spaces need to be? How connected do they need to be? We really know very little about animal and we know more about animal connectivity in cities than we know very little about plant connectivity in cities. How does heterogeneity within and also across green spaces support or drive assemblages? And then this is a really important question. When do green spaces act as ecological traps or population sinks? For management, there's a lot of, I listed more questions. You can see which way my research is going. But what are some thresholds that consider humans, right? So like I said, these are where humans are interacting with nature. So there are feedbacks between what people perceive and how they manage for, one thing we really like in our parks are tall trees and long, large areas of lawn, right? So nothing in between. But this is not great for biodiversity, right? So we need more structure, more vegetation structure in these parks. But it's how do we get people to perceive that as important and not be scared? Because there's a lot of evidence that people are scared of crime behind bushes. People hide, burglars hiding behind bushes, that kind of thing. So how do we balance that? Also, what are the best management practices to balance human risks? So dead wood is incredibly important ecologically, but no one wants a branch to fall on them, right? So, New York City spends a ton of money on pruning back branches and dead trees, but then they're not providing that ecological service for decomposition, for animal habitat, and so on. Some of these others include, in general, how do social and economic factors drive green space management? How do ecological communities of urban green spaces respond to different management activities? So there's some new research from the Forest Service and Susanna Lerman in particular, looking at lawns. And it made the news. It was a big deal. They found that mowing every 2 weeks rather than every week, mowing every 2 weeks to 4 inches rather than every week actually maintains pollinator and plant diversity in lawns. And it's acceptable to people because it's short enough and it's not quite, it's every 2 weeks. So this was a big deal. This is a direct management application of, a direct ecological application of different management regimes. All right. So I want to end, I'm not ending yet, but by giving a case study talking about restoration, because we all know it's not that easy to promote biodiversity in green spaces, especially in urban areas where they're wildly different soils due to different anthropogenic activities and fill, wildly different uses in parks, and people accepting natural areas. So we were interested in how do we maintain ecological connections between urban and natural areas of the city. We were also interested in how do we adapt to climate change, and in particular, this was done in Jamaica Bay, so rising sea levels. And then incorporating civic engagement and stewardship into restoration projects. So this work was done Jamaica Bay. Here we are. Here's New Brunswick, where Rutgers is. And this is Jamaica Bay. A little bit closer up. We set up 10 sites in different parks across the Jamaica Bay in Brooklyn and Queens. And these parks were assessed by the U.S. Forest Service social scientists as part of their park use and ecological and social assessment of parks. So we worked with them to choose different types of parks, different usages. For example, this park right up here is a tiny little park that is dominated by a cricket pitch. So it's primarily used by the Cricket League. But there's some edge habitat that we can use for restoration and incorporate native biodiversity into these areas. One of these other parks has a strong neighborhood association that watches over the parks. One of these up here is right near a big mall, and it's just people just walk through. They don't even look at what is there. It's a long linear corridor along a canal and the mall and a road over here, and people just walk through to get to the mall. So then this is a national, this is Gateway National Wildlife Refuge. So I was really interested, okay, how can we take these, we have tons of lawns, right? The United States in particular, we have a lot of lawn area. How could we take some of those lawns to be ecologically, or to support more diversity, basically? And we can take little pieces of parks that aren't being used, but we can also use these not just to promote ecological diversity and restoration, understand restoration in cities, but also to show people, the community, what types of native plants that can be utilized in their yards and gardens. So we worked with Amanda Bailey, who was at New York City Parks, a landscape architect in New York City Parks at the time. And we designed this experiment. We call it a designed experiment after Alex Felson's work, and designed this, our different species and distribution of these different species so that it would look pretty eventually when it grew in, for people to walk through and say, oh, hey, I really like New England aster. I'm gonna plant this in my yard. Or hey, I really like Prunus maritima, which is beach plum. And so because we were on the coast, we chose species that are found in coastal, urban, I mean, not necessarily urban, but coastal habitats, really kind of picking out a coastal grassland, shrubland habitat. And we chose species that are colorful, that provide fruit and flowers also for insects and birds. So these are our species. You see we have some really pretty solidagos, our goldenrods, Ilex opaca, which is American holly, has these nice red berries, milkweeds. Everybody is really into planting milkweeds right now for the monarchs. And we planted them. And we followed a few different things in terms of at the site scale, plant population dynamics. Are these, we're planting these upland from these species upland from where they're normally found because we're planning for sea level rise. But we're also planting them in wildly different soils, from more natural soils, these sandy, this is what the soils should look like on this coast, to these high organic soils in a swale on the side of a park. And so can we even do this? Can we restore? Can we provide connections, and can we restore in response to to sea level rise? So after a couple of years, this is what they look like. This is a site right on, the water is literally right out here, but it's has, the soil is heavy fill. So there's a lot of mugwort in this site. This is a more natural soil, and so we're seeing a lot of our species come in nicely. I also forgot to mention that we had 2 treatments, 4 treatments. We weeded some of the plots, we tilled some of the plots to ameliorate soil compaction, and then we left some of the plots the same. And so we're following, over time, we're following growth and reproduction of different species. This is bayberry, Morella pennsylvanica. In general, not surprisingly, many species are responding, in particular to sand content of the soil. So Morelia does pretty well the more sand there is. It's a beach, it's found on dunes, so right behind the primary dunes, on the back of the primary dunes. So it loves sand, but some of our other species did terrible in the sand, even though they are part of the community of maritime shrublands. And then we also found early results. So we want to follow this over 10, 15 years. Early results found that actually for most of the species, I'm just showing bayberry here, but that not tilling was important and actively weeding. So really reducing competition. So not tilling, so tilling turns out it's important to ameliorate soil compaction, but it also allows for the existing seed bank it disturbs the soil enough so the existing seed bank, which is mostly full of mugwort and some phragmites, although, yeah, to come up. And so the competition is actually a really important component of ecological restoration success in these sites. The other component of this project was to look at civic engagement. And so really, if we think about social ecological systems, the ultimate goal is that social resiliency will lead to ecological resiliency and so on. And so we wanted to ask what types of restoration stewardship activities people would be interested in, because these are smack in the middle of parks. And some of the parks we chose, of course, were parks that had, that were just, people just went through and didn't pay attention to. And some of the parks had very strong neighborhood groups that managed the parks themselves. And so we asked this question: what aspects of individuals' environmental knowledge, identity, demographics, and views of engagement in their community might predict willingness to engage in restoration stewardship activities? And this project was led by Amanda Sorensen, who's now a postdoc at University of Nebraska, and Gloria Blasi, who was an undergraduate at Rutgers and is now a graduate student in natural resources here. And she's not here today, unfortunately. She's in the city, working in the city. So we asked a bunch of questions. I was really interested in this part of it, as well as stewardship capacity. What do people think of these plants? Like, you can't find these at Home Depot. So what do people think of them? Would they plant them in their yards? We also asked questions about stewardship capacity. So what are their views, motivations? What do they think of climate change? What is their views on climate change and adaptation to climate change? And actually, it turns out, because this area was heavily hit by Hurricane Sandy, that they are very well aware of the impacts of climate change, and they're very supportive of anything that could possibly help ameliorate those effects. And so on. So they visited parks on both weekend and weekday hours during peak summer use. And they randomized sampling. So they picked basically every third person they saw, they interviewed them. And what do they find? So one of the, these are some of the questions they found. What they found most importantly was this is what predicts people's willingness to be involved in restoration activities in the city. And so if they said yes, that research on the role or effect of native plants is important, they were highly likely to want to participate. If they thought native plants and animals served an important role, age was important. So older, this is found in a lot of these types of surveys in environmental stewardship, that older people are more likely to be involved and say they want to be involved. What was interesting, so these are all the other questions that came out as important predictor of stewardship. Preserving local biodiversity, when they volunteer, they want to go outdoors, and so on. They found that perceptions of themselves as an environment wasn't a strong predictor of stewardship, and gender and education also was not, and race and ethnicity was not an important predictor of stewardship. One of the really interesting, I thought this was interesting, but I'm coming from a pretty strict ecology side of this, was that people were more interested in taking care of the restoration than collecting data. And the reason that they weren't as interested in collecting data was because they were afraid they would do it wrong, that the scientists, it wouldn't be useful to scientists. But taking care of the site, weeding, participating in cleanup events, and so on, that was they were very likely to want to participate in that. As for perceptions, this I thought was the most fun. So they showed them they did this the first year, 1 year after planting. So our designed experiments did not look very nice. They weren't grown in. So we couldn't show people the actual sites, the actual restoration sites, but they showed pictures of the plants. So basically, they had people rate the different species as very attractive, somewhat attractive, not attractive at all. Microstygium is not planted there, but it was added as a distractor item. So one species people hated, was northern bayberry, which is funny because it's often used in this horticulturally, but it looked a lot messier because you can clip it back and it looks, square and it looks very nice, but this picture did not look like that. People love New York aster. Why? This is bayberry. This is New York aster. You can see why people loved it. We asked, would they consider, if this was sold at the Home Depot next to the mall, next to the one park, would they buy it? Yes, they would consider using native plants. Only a few people said no. I'm sure there's some bias here in terms of wanting to please the surveyor, but overall, this is a pretty good result. And then they asked people just to give, what do they like about the plants shown? So of the plants they liked, what did they like about them? And so flowers, that's a big one. So things like milkweed, beach plum, solidago, they all have nice showy flowers and people really like them. They said they were pretty and colorful. They like the shape, the purple, that's New England aster, right there. And what did they not like? Sorry. They did not like, some of the plants they didn't like, really this stuck out as water and mosquitoes. They thought the plants, the kind of messy shape they just looked kind of natural, but messy, would attract mosquitoes. They don't, but that's another story. Some were boring. They said they look like weeds. And my personal favorite, which is very New York, is so what can we learn from all of this research? This is very quick and dirty. So what can we learn about design in general and designing urban habitats from the entire talk, right? Well, design occurs, of course, at different scales, right? And so at the city-wide scale, increasing naturally vegetated green space is really important. We showed that in that global study where intact vegetation, large amounts of intact or more intact vegetation, which means natural vegetation, led to more species. And then also providing connectivity within the city and surrounding region. At the neighborhood scale, I didn't talk about some of the other results, but having a local champion is really important. So and fostering connections with among residential yards and other urban green spaces with community engagement. So one of the parks that we looked at, we did have, of course, in any urban experiment, you have vandalism. One of our sites was never touched. And that's because Mr. Rogers, who's the probably 70-year-old African-American man, the first day we were out there, he came up, we talked to him, he loved our project, and he said, "Don't worry about the teenagers, I'll talk to them." No one touched our site. So having a local champion or a group, we also had another site where we had the Queens Park Alliance and Friends of Springfield Park, and they made sure that the restoration sites weren't vandalized. We had another site that was behind a fence, and we lost the site to an illegal chop shop. So we kept going back to sample. Well, the first time we went out there to plant, there's a neighborhood right by it. They called the police on us. The third time, we got the police called on the second time too, which was kind of, but then we go out a year later and the lock on the fence was a new lock and we couldn't get in, and the park manager couldn't get in either. And it's kind of a wild area behind the fence. So it's not lawn, it's not used, it's just a wild park area. And it turns out, so we would go in, finally got to go in, and we stopped going there because people were looking at us and they fully set up a chop shop there. So the neighbors called the police on us, but not on this, business that was probably neighborhood driven, somebody in the neighborhood. So community engagement is important. And we know that from the restoration literature too. And it just makes sense, of course, that it's important. And at the habitat scale, I didn't talk a lot about this, but soil is incredibly important. You all know this, right? I don't have to tell the horticulturalists that soil is important, or the soil scientists. Promoting vegetation structure and design, that will then promote other species and the charismatic megafauna, like the birds. Providing native plants that provide, planting native plants or others, cultivars that provide flowers, fruit, and other resources for wildlife. And of course, invasive, you can't get away from invasive species management. If we didn't pull out all the mugwort from those sites, from those restoration sites, there would be no success at all. Yeah. Oh, time, yeah, okay, great. So finally, I wanted to just introduce UrbBioNet and encourage you to participate. You can check out our website here, but we also do a crosstown walk, which is a teaching module at every Ecological Society of America for the last 6 years. And I'll take any questions. Questions?
One thing about your survey with the people, I think you have to be careful that many folks out there would not know a flower from a fruit,
Right.
or the red leaves. I wasn't even sure what the plant was that had the red leaves.
Right.
People would think that was a flower.
Right, yeah.
We have to be careful not to assume too much.
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah, those pictures were not the pictures they used. Those were mine, but still, you're absolutely right. I mean, the sumac, that looks like it could be flowers, right, from a picture. Yeah. So I think the important part would be to follow that up with the actual restoration sites. But we have lost a lot of them due to miscommunication amongst parks. Yeah.
I think a well-manicured lawn is one of the least biodiverse things in the universe, and mine is just full of everything, you know? And I like it that way. I never put fertilizer on it.
Right.
Would you advocate that in green spaces that have lawn to be allow them to be a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was talking about Susanna Lerman's research that lawn, and I didn't talk about less pests. So lawns with less pesticides and herbicides and all that they have been shown to be the most diverse, of course, for plants, but also in terms of for insects too. So my lawn probably looks very similar to yours. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
You had said that one of your questions in the beginning was, how do you put together natural habitat with preferred human habitat and concerns about safety? Do you have any theories for how those two things could be merged together?
So I haven't done surveys or people's perceptions of these, but there are some really good examples through landscape architecture research and design for this. One of them is to have clearly marked boundaries between in the paths between where people and nature. And so, for example, in New York, the Thane Family Forest is an old growth forest at New York Botanic Garden. They have and also wide paths. So they have very wide paths in the forest, and they have basically a low fence, but it's pretty low wood, so it doesn't look bad. And that's very popular. People aren't afraid to walk through the woods there because they're separated. They feel comfortable enough, but it's also beautiful. So having those cues to care, Joan Nassar came up with that phrase, the cues to care, that it's actually cared for. So people tend to like that more, or having wide, if you have a meadow, having really wide, like 5 foot wide paths through the meadow. So it looks like it's cared for. Yeah.
How long were the plants watered after you planted them for the coastal regeneration?
A year. No, the first summer. We actually ended up having a drought that summer, so we had to water. Yeah, if we hadn't watered, nothing would have survived. Yeah, as it was, we had a low survivorship of milkweeds because of that. But I can never grow milkweeds in any experiment. I don't know why. They come up in my yard without me doing anything, but I can't get them to work in experiments. But yeah, we did water, and we're trying to follow these. We have a few left. The cricket the cricket club put a big storage unit on top of one of our sites. We lost the chop shop. There's a couple others, but we have a few that we can still follow through time. Yeah.
Well, a couple of things. I wanted to know whether you found any non-native plants that came into your plots that were not like naives or invasive, non-native, but non-invasive plants that came in. And then the other part was in terms of safety in the landscape. You find it useful to have a 2 and 6 thing. You have shrubs at a 2 foot level, and then you have a clear space, and then you have trees or large shrubs that are 6 foot.
So you could see through.
Right. So that makes you able to have layers without having a wall.
Nice. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah. I can't remember exactly. We did have a lot. Yeah, we had a lot of things come up that were non-native. We only had a few invasives, like the Artemisia and the Phragmites. Yeah, we had a lot of colonization of these sites because we opened up soil. And we talked about this earlier. We don't really need to worry about those things, but they were all very similar. So a lot of those weeds I showed as the cosmopolitan, the city slickers, those were a lot of the ones that come up in these, they're ruderal plants. They come up in these like recently disturbed environments. But they're not really out-competing native plants. They may be changing soil, but maybe for the better.
They provide plant flowers.
Yeah, sure, exactly, yeah.
I don't see Don Raycow anymore.
He
So.
doesn't leave.
Okay. So thank our speaker, and there's going to be a graduate ceremony.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.